What you make me think of then is that how, in the ready attempt to locate das Ding in a given object, in a given other subject, that there's an attempt to domesticate this radical dimension of negativity, which is of the subject themselves.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. I mean, and this is the way in which the importance of this question, one of the theoretical ways, another thing I cut from the book, I had to shorten it considerably. This is the difference in Lacan's whole understanding of anxiety from Heidegger's understanding of it. For Heidegger, like for Sartre, who's basically taking it from Heidegger, anxiety is the dizziness of my own freedom, the dizziness of my own. It's Dasein for Heidegger, Dasein's kind of recoil in the face of its limitless possibilities. I mean, it's kind of it's sheer openness to being. Its sheer exposure, you might say, to being is itself the source of anxiety, as if it's my own vertiginous experience of my own subjectivity that's the problem. And Lacan, interestingly, says, no. Anxiety is the vertigo in the face of what I don't know in the other. That's where it starts. The anxiety is outside myself. But of course, the trick, the great call for us all, the great task, you might say, is to not leave it in the other, but to discover it in oneself.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It's funny you mentioned Heidegger, because that actually was my next question. And one of the things that I think we've managed to note, or to perhaps emphasize, is that if we're thinking of das Ding in a way, you could say topologically, by which I mean thing as void, as a kind of power of emptiness that could be located in multiple different places, rather than being statically connected to any one, monolithic presentation, is that, of course, that does call to mind Heidegger's, famous notion of das Ding as identified with, and I'm quoting you here, as identified with the void that inhabits the pot or base, a core of emptiness. You've made some fascinating comments linking Heidegger and Lacan, and one which I'll never forget. You did in a conference presentation. You gave an example of where Lacan is more Heideggerian than Heidegger, which I just loved. But what is most important for us to remember here about the Heideggerian notion of das Ding? And where does Lacan part company with facets of Heidegger's conceptualization?
Well, that's a big question.
Sorry, it's kind of impossible to answer.
Yeah, well, I'm begging off a little bit, because I think it's a really complicated question, Lacan's relation to Heidegger. I think he is genuinely drawn to many aspects of Heidegger's thought, but I also think that it's really important to see the distance between the two of them. And the first one I would say is this distance in the whole conception of anxiety. For Heidegger, he introduces anxiety in being in time before he gets to Mitsein, being with others. That's after. Lacan would say, that's ridiculous. I mean, no, anxiety is originally found in the subject's relation to the other, and precisely to this dimension of what is uncognizable, what is therefore unknown and threatening in the other. So anxiety is yes, it's me outside myself in the first place. Although Lacan is not going to leave it there. Anxiety is also about my own abyss, my own character as unknown to myself. And these things play off of each other, as we know. I mean, this is the most kind of familiar thing about projection, that I hide from myself what is most anxiety producing in my own depths by restyling the other in the image of what I would like to despise. So I deny all of my own homosexual inclinations by finding the wretched queer outside myself who I can enjoy hating and demeaning and so on. Notice there's also an interesting way in which we find something similar in Heidegger and Lacan on language. For Heidegger, language is part of that tissue of everydayness, which he describes as Gerede, this idle speech. Language, it's actually very, as many commentators have remarked, Heidegger's conception of language is not that far, unless you read it very generously. It's not that far from Wittgenstein's. What does it mean, says Wittgenstein? We don't need to have this kind of worry that language is not going to connect with reality because it's always rather approximate. He would say, well, it's not nonsensical to say, stand roughly here. We don't have to be sort of positivistic about language. We use language to accomplish everyday tasks where, as Heidegger would say, we know our way about. Or actually, Wittgenstein says that, but Heidegger's got the same sense, that we already know our pathways. The Dasein is familiar already. It's in the world. Lacan, I think, I don't go into this in the book. It's another thing that I actually wrote a chapter on and had to cut it. It's got to go in some other book. But Lacan's conception, and I do go into this, Lacan's conception of language contains always some kind of at least potential for this dimension of something of the thing. That is to say, it's always possible, and Lacan says this sometimes in the most kind of simple ways. It says it's always possible to ask about what someone has just said to you. Yes, I hear what you're saying, but
why?
What are you really talking about? What do you really mean? That I don't get at all. Do you? It's kind of like for Lacan, every time we enter into language, we're not only in the world of everydayness, of Alltäglichkeit, as Heidegger calls it, where I am accustomed to the meaning that guides me, guides Dasein on its sort of familiar paths. It's, for Lacan, always something potentially excessive. Even the simplest thing, which is why he can say that the unconscious is structured like a language, that language intrinsically has this unstable, excessive dimension. That, I think, it's very interesting to see Heidegger in his later work try to struggle to put into language what in Being and Time he basically leaves out of it, which is this excessive, uncontrolled, dinglich dimension. I think it's really interesting that Heidegger takes as his example of das Ding, which is a very different problematic in Heidegger than it is in Lacan. It's overlapping in some ways, but it's also not the same. His is the container. Das Ding is the vase, the jug, the pot, which is of immense practical use. And it relates to being outside itself as raising the question, what shall we put in the pot? What can the pot contain? How does the pot contain, even as Heidegger says, the fourfold? The Lacanian ding is a long way from that. In a certain sense, it's the opposite of the Heideggerian bowl, the Heideggerian pot. It's not a container, it's precisely the realization that something here is utterly uncontained and uncontainable, something that escapes my capacity to even think it, let alone contain it.
I would be remiss if I weren't to ask you the question which so often comes up when the concept of das Ding is introduced. And it's a twofold question. Why does it disappear? Why does Lacan seem to neglect it? My own sense is, we had a brief conversation about this ages ago, just in passing, and my somewhat unenlightened view was that, it's kind of a stupid idea, was that maybe Lacan jettisons it, so to speak, because it does too much explanatory work. There's too much that it becomes overfreighted, but that's just my view. So why does he give it up? And the second question is, well, presumably, because an answer comes to that, well, presumably he's now got the concept of object A. And if that's true, what's this crucial difference between the two? So I've got a little Žižekian paraphrase where poor old Slavoj Žižek's ears must be burning because he keeps on coming up, but which I can give you. But first off, why? Let's get your take on those questions. Why does Lacan end up seemingly neglecting or foregoing what seems an immensely powerful and important concept? And if the answer is, well, because object A is a more efficient, effective, whatever psychoanalytic concept, then what is the difference between the two?
Yeah, okay, that's, yeah, and as you know, I've really thought a lot about this question because it is very strange. I mean, the excitement and enthusiasm with which he, and gravity with which he introduces the notion in 57. I think I'm having the right year here. The seventh seminar. Is it? I've forgotten the year. Maybe it's 61. Anyway, yeah, 60. Okay, thank you very much. Thank you. 59, 60. He just trumpets it in the first half, and then, as you know, in the second half, it virtually disappears. Todd McGowan, as you may know, has written a lovely essay. It's not out yet, I believe, but it's about the ethics, and particularly about the second half, about Antigone. And he talks about how you can construe the essential thematics and problem of Das Ding as still informing very much the discussion of Antigone, but that's neither here nor there. I agree with it, by the way. But it's very strange that he seems to back away from it. And as you say, it leaves us with this question, we who try to follow Lacan, sort of understand him, what happened? Well, one of the things that's important to remember is that it doesn't totally disappear. It comes back the next year in the transference seminar in a quite interesting way, where in the ethics he said that sublimation occurs when the mere object is risen to the dignity of Das Ding. Very, itself something we could write reams about, a very interesting idea. By the way, this implies that dignitas, what we think of as dignity, what we are impressed by, presumably must contain some important and rather forward dimension of the unknown, of something beyond us. By the way, we're halfway to the experience of the sacred when we say that. What has dignitas is a half step toward the sacred, as something that's impressive, that we understand somehow on a gut level. We don't master this. This is beyond me in some sense. Mm-hmm. So he comes back to it in the transference and says, no, sublimation is also, he says, a kind of, the beautiful in particular, not all sublimation, but the beautiful is a kind of defense against Das Ding, a kind of cordon of safety, which keeps the really abyssal character of Das Ding a little bit half step away. Then, of course, in the 10th seminar, he makes the comment about anxiety. Anxiety not without an object, the most ultimate object, Das Ding, the most profound object, he says. Then he comes back again, this several years later in the 16th seminar, he mentions Das Ding, I don't know, half a dozen times or so. And then in the 20th, he even comes back yet again and links it to jealousy. So he doesn't totally leave it. Nevertheless, you're absolutely right. We're faced with this big question. Why does he 99% leave it? And I think I would say two big things. First, you've already said, the problematic is taken up by Lacan, for good or for bad, in his theorizing of the objet A. The objet A becomes the replacement of the strange feature of the other, which, you know, the beauty mark of Marilyn Monroe that somehow sets off her beauty even more for being a kind of strange, excessive imperfection. That strange feature was an original telltale of Das Ding, taken from directly out of Freud's text, but carried on by Lacan. And the objet A takes that over. Also, the whole question of the sort of ontological ambiguity of Das Ding is taken up into objet A. This is an object which Lacan is not afraid to say is not actually an object. We can't tell where we start in the object, or where the object starts and where we end, and so on and so forth. It's ambiguous in the extreme. But I would say, though I think this is a very good answer and probably accurate to how, in some large part, how Lacan thought about it, it also repeats the question: why was the objet petit a better foil, a better vehicle for somehow getting us into this abyssal dimension than Das Ding? I suspect the other part of it was that he feared its proximity to Heidegger. Both that it would get confused by what Lacan could not, I think, resist when he first encounters it. When he first encounters the essay on Das Ding and then the whole monograph of Heidegger on the thing, I think my sense is that he just, got just overexcited and sort of that, oh, this is fabulous. And then later, as he began to realize, well, wait a second, what Heidegger's talking about intersects in some interesting ways with what I'm trying to do, but in a lot of ways, it's really inadequate to what I'm after. And my comments on anxiety, the conception of anxiety and the conception of language in the two thinkers, I think is very relevant to this. But I think he then says, it's not worth my risking being overly conflated with Heidegger, or being even, heaven forbid, getting known as a Heideggerian epigone and so on. So I think that my suspicion is that played a huge role. I think he was, but one last little tiny comment. I think Lacan was, as I read him, as I imagine him, probably fairer to say, I think he was fascinated by the ontological. And I think he was fascinated by what Heidegger called, in Being and Time, fundamental ontology. But I think he was really afraid of it, because his ontology, Lacan's, was an ontology which was, you might almost say, second to language. Logos has it all over ontology for Lacan, where it doesn't necessarily as much, I think, for Heidegger. At least he didn't trust that he would put his passengers in Heidegger's boat.